Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Today I'm going to talk about two tragedies and two responses. Last week, two young African American people were killed. The first one was a 9-year-old child in Ferguson. She was killed on Tuesday. She was in her home, in her mother's room, doing her homework, and she was shot to death. Apparently, the killer fired multiple shots into a bedroom window. So this wasn't a case of a random shooting. This shooting was deliberate. Apparently, the killer intended to kill someone in that house. And during that same week, last week, another African American young person was killed. His name is Mansur Ball-Bey. He's an 18-year-old teenage boy. He was shot and killed by the police. Apparently, the police were executing a search warrant. They went onto the premises, and the police alleged that two armed young black men fled the scene. And they claim that Mansur Ball-Bey turned and pointed a weapon at the police. And at that point, they decided to fire shots at him, and they killed him. Eyewitnesses say that Mansur was unarmed. They say he did not point a weapon at the police. And later, an autopsy report was released. And that report showed that Mansur Ball-Bey was shot in the back. And that, just from a common sense perspective, calls into question the police's account of what occurred. If someone is pointing a gun at you and you fire at that person, it seems more likely than not that you would hit that person from the front instead of the back. So for me, that autopsy report raises questions. And the fact that you had eyewitnesses there who said that he was unarmed, that also raises questions for me as well. Now, people have taken these two events and they've created a lot of false narratives. They've used these two events to relay a couple of things. The first thing is they perpetuate this idea that African Americans are violent. They use this killing of this young girl to basically paint the black community with a broad brush and make all kinds of assumptions about black people being violent. The animal who killed this young girl is not a reflection of the entire community. The overwhelming majority of African Americans are law-abiding. The overwhelming majority of African Americans are doing what they need to do to make it in life. They're either working or they're going to school, just like any other group of people. So this notion that black people are inherently violent is preposterous. These acts of violence that occur in our communities are committed by a minority within the community. Certainly, the violence is disproportionate in our communities for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is the lack of opportunity that exists in our communities, the disproportionate poverty, the high unemployment rate, the influx of guns and drugs, and the failing schools. All of these things contribute to the violence that exists in these communities. And even with the fact that there's a disproportionate amount of violence in these communities for the social economic reasons that I pointed out, the fact of the matter remains that those acts of violence are committed by a minority within that community. And a couple of days ago, I saw an article in the Baltimore Sun. And this article basically highlighted how violence is directly tied to socioeconomic conditions, the conditions that I talked about before. It correlates unemployment with crime, and they use actual maps to do so. So I will include a link to that article in the description box to this video so you can see it for yourself. But that's one of the false narratives that is presented, and this whole problem of violence is presented outside of context to suggest that African Americans are inherently violent and that that's our nature, instead of like considering the social economic conditions that create the violence. Also, another false narrative that is put out here is this notion that black people do not really care about black lives. There's this notion that we only care about the issue of violence is when police commit violence against African Americans, or when white people commit violence against African Americans. There's this notion that somehow black communities don't care about inner city violence. That has to be one of the most ridiculous ideas that has ever been presented. All over the country, you see people holding vigils for the slain. And the reason why this comes up is because right after Mansur Ball-Bey was killed, there were protests in the street. People were demonstrating and expressing their outrage. And there's a reason why that's the case, because here we are a year after the killing of Michael Brown, and still there are incidents of police brutality all over this country. So the people are on edge, the people are outraged. And this killing of Mansur Ball-Bey took place in St. Louis, which is very close to where Michael Brown was killed. So there is a sensitivity in our community, a sense of anger in the community. So that's the reason why you have people protesting. Well, some took this as an example of how black people don't care about inner city violence, but we're concerned about police brutality. They said, well, people were protesting when Mansur was killed, but they weren't protesting when Jamyla Bolden, who's the 9-year-old that was killed in Ferguson. They basically said, well, no one was protesting when she was killed. When the fact of the matter is there was a large vigil held for her. There were members of the community speaking out against the senseless violence that took her life. So this notion that black people don't care is ridiculous. And here in Baltimore, we have an example, a shining example of how black people care about these issues. But that doesn't get the same type of media attention that the protests against police brutality get. There's an organization here called 300 Man March. They held a rally against police brutality, actually a rally against inner city violence yesterday. The rally is called Enough is Enough. So they held that rally against violence. And also, like a week ago, they marched from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. to bring attention to the issue of inner city violence. So this notion that black people don't care about black lives when black lives are taken by black people, that idea is insane. Because all over this country, you have similar demonstrations of outrage. You have vigils around the country. You have protests against the violence. So we need to stop buying into this false notion, this propaganda that's put out here that black people don't care about black lives. And the reason why they put that out there is not because these media outlets are genuinely concerned about black lives. The only reason why they put that out there is because they want to deflect. They want to change the subject away from police brutality, racial profiling, and other forms of police misconduct. And it's important for us to understand that there is a connection between police misconduct and the inner city violence that we see in our communities. There's a connection between police abuse and the whole no snitching culture that exists in these communities. When the police harass people, when the police brutalize and humiliate people, then the people are less likely to turn to the police when there are acts of violence in the community. They are less likely to report crimes when there is brutality, when the police are untrustworthy, when the police are agents of oppression. They are less likely to report crime. So that point needs to be emphasized. If you want to deal with crime in the community, you have to deal with building better relationships between the police and the community. And you can't build better relationships when you kill young people without justification. When you harm our people, when you harass our people, when you stop us and frisk us for no reason other than the color of our skin. So the two are linked. And the final point that I want to make is this. I don't know if Mansur was armed or unarmed. And I will reserve judgment on his killing until I have all the evidence. But if he was unarmed, then I will continue to speak out for him and his family like I've done for many other victims of police brutality. If he was actually armed, then this is not a case that I'm going to be speaking about. It's not a case that I support. And that brings me to one point. And that's this. There was a music video featuring Mansur Ball-Bey. And this video is a rap video. And in the video, him and his fellow friends and rappers are glorifying inner city violence. They are glorifying drug abuse and drug use and drug selling. And there are some things that I have to say about that. First of all, regardless of the content of the video, that doesn't justify what the police did. Once all the facts are established, we'll determine whether or not the police were justified. There are reasonable questions, as I raised before, about the incident. Once those questions have been resolved, then we'll know about whether or not the police were justified. But this video alone doesn't establish anything. But it brings me to a point, and that's this. If we want the world to value Black life, then we have to value it ourselves. We have to stop celebrating music that glorifies violence in our community, that glorifies murder in our community, that glorifies drug dealing and drug abuse. We have to take a stand against this. And I know that years ago, you had an activist, Dolores C. Tucker, and people thought she was crazy when she stood up against this music. But she was on the money. She was on point. She was a visionary, ahead of her time. This music is the soundtrack to our own destruction as a people. And it's time for us to turn that music off and wake the hell up. And I'll make this last point. Young people, do not allow yourself to be used as propaganda against yourself. When you take photos or participate in activity that paints you in a negative light, you need to understand that our enemy will use that video or those photos against you. They will use it to justify the violence that is committed against you.